My name is Claire. For 5 years, my world was measured in milligrams, pill organizers, and the rhythmic wheezing of an oxygen concentrator. While my cousins were posting filtered photos from infinity pools in Bali, and my siblings were debating which vintage of wine to serve at their gala dinners, I was in a drafty Victorian manner learning the intimate map of my Aunt Eleanor's pain. I wasn't the favorite. I was the one who stayed when the glamour faded and the diagnosis became a life sentence. They saw me as a glorified servant, a placeholder in the family tree who lacked the ambition to live her own life. They didn't realize that in those 5 years of silence, I wasn't just a caregiver. I was the only person Eleanor truly trusted. Today, Eleanor is gone, and the vultures have landed on the front porch, black veils fluttering in the wind, eyes scanning the mahogany furniture for price tags. They've come to evict the poor relative and claim their spoils. But Eleanor left a final message, a digital ghost that is about to remind them that inheritance isn't a birthright. It's a reward for those who didn't look away. The air in Blackwood Manor had changed the moment the undertakers left. For 5 years it had smelled of lavender water, rubbing alcohol, and the sharp metallic tang of the nebulizer. Now it smelled of expensive perfume and damp wool. My family had arrived before the tea was even cold. "It's a lovely view, really," my cousin Beatrice said, her voice echoing through the grand parlor as she ran a gloved finger along the edge of an 18th century sideboard. "If we knock down that wall and install floor-to-ceiling glass, the property value will double. We could flip this place in 6 months." 6 months? I was thinking of keeping it as a summer retreat, my brother Marcus countered, pouring himself a generous glass of Eleanor's finest sherry. He didn't even look at the empty armchair by the fireplace, the one where Eleanor had sat every afternoon for half a decade. "Of course, we'd have to gut the kitchen. It's practically medieval." I stood in the doorway, my hands still red from scrubbing the last of the medicinal spills from the nightstand upstairs. I was wearing a simple black dress that felt too tight across my chest, not because of the fabric, but because of the suffocating arrogance in the room. "It's only been 4 hours ago," I said, my voice sounding raspy from days of whispered prayers and sleepless vigils. "Could we perhaps wait until the body is actually in the ground before we start the renovation plans?" Beatrice turned to me, her expression a mix of pity and practiced condescension. "Oh, Claire, we appreciate everything you did, truly. You were a saint to stay here all this time. But let's be realistic. This house is a massive responsibility. It's far too much for for someone of your modest means. We've already arranged for a moving van to come by on Tuesday, just to help you get your things back to your little apartment in the city." "My little apartment?" I asked, a cold spark of electricity running down my spine. "I gave up that apartment 4 years ago, Beatrice. I live here. This has been my home." "Technically, it was Eleanor's home," Marcus interjected, swirling his sherry, "and now it's an asset of the estate. As the primary blood heirs, Beatrice and I, along with the others, have a duty to maximize the value of that asset. You were a caregiver, a wonderful one. We'll make sure there's a nice bonus in it once the probate is settled. 10,000? 15? It should be enough for a fresh start." $15,000 for 5 years of 24-hour care? I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "I've spent more than that on gas and groceries because you lot couldn't be bothered to send a check for her basic needs. I stayed when she couldn't remember her own name. I stayed when she was screaming in the middle of the night because the phantom pain was too much. Where were you when the nurses quit because she was too difficult to handle?" "We were busy, Claire. We have careers, families, lives that move at a different pace than this stagnant mausoleum," snapped Beatrice, her patience finally wearing thin. "The point is, the house belongs to the family, and you are at best a distant branch. We found the old will from 2015. It splits everything 3 ways between Marcus, me, and my younger sister. You aren't mentioned, dear, not even for a silver spoon." I looked at them, my family. They looked like characters in a play, mourning in high-fashion black while their hearts were already calculating the commission on the estate sale. They hadn't touched her hand while it was cold. They hadn't heard her last breath. "There's a newer version," I said, my voice regaining its strength. "Eleanor had a lawyer visit last November. She was very clear about her intentions." "November? She was barely lucid in November." Marcus laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "She probably thought she was signing a birthday card. Any document from that period will be contested instantly. Diminished capacity, Claire. Look it up. Now go upstairs and start packing. We want to do a full inventory of the jewelry by sunset." I didn't move. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver thumb drive. It was cool against my palm. "She knew you'd say that," I said. "She knew you'd come for the stones and the mahogany before you even noticed she was gone. She left a video. She called it her final diagnostic." I walked over to the large smart TV mounted above the fireplace, a modern intrusion Eleanor had insisted on so she could watch the birds in the garden through the security cameras. I plugged it in. The screen flickered to life. The image was sharp, high definition, and painfully intimate. It was Eleanor, sitting in her bed, propped up by pillows. She looked frail, her skin like parchment, but her eyes were as bright and sharp as diamonds. This wasn't a woman with diminished capacity. This was a woman who was finally taking her aim. "To my dear family," the video Eleanor began, her voice thin but steady. "If you are watching this, it means the vultures have landed. I can almost hear Marcus pouring my sherry and Beatrice measuring the drapes. I imagine you've already found the 2015 will. It was a useful document, wasn't it? It gave you the comfort you needed to ignore my phone calls for 5 years. Beatrice gasped, her face turning a blotchy red. Marcus froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "I decided to conduct a little experiment. I wanted to see who really knew me. Not the woman with the bank accounts, but the woman with the failing lungs. I wanted to see who knew the smell of my life. Most of you only know the smell of my money. You know the scent of my perfumes and the leather of my cars, but only one of you knows the smell of my medicine. Only one of you knows the exact scent of the eucalyptus oil I need for my chest, the metallic tang of the oxygen tanks, and the bitter herbal steam of the teas that kept my heart beating one more day." Eleanor leaned closer to the camera, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I have left everything, this house, the accounts in Zurich, the investments, and every single asset you are currently drooling over, to the person who sat in the dark with me, to the person who knows that my favorite medicine isn't a pill, but the scent of the rain on the porch. I have left it all to Claire." The room plunged to a silence so profound I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Marcus's glass shattered on the floor, the sherry staining the Persian rug like a fresh wound. "This is a fraud," Beatrice screamed, her voice hitting a frequency that made my ears ring. "You were drugged. You manipulated her, Claire. You kept us away so you could brainwash her." "Kept you away?" I asked, turning to face her. "I sent you 100 emails. I called you every time she went into the hospital. You blocked my number, Beatrice. You told your assistant to tell me you were out of the country every time I asked for help with the bills."
I pulled a folded stack of papers from the sideboard, the ones the lawyer had delivered a week ago, notarized and sealed with the state's highest authority. "These are the deeds," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and triumph. "The 2015 will was revoked. The trust was restructured. As of 10 a.m. this morning, I am the sole owner of Blackwood Manor, and as the owner, I find that the smell of your perfume is suddenly very unwelcome." I walked to the front door and opened it wide, letting the cold autumn air rush into the house. "The moving van you ordered? You should call them, but not for my things, for yours. You have 1 hour to take your coats and get off my property. Anything left behind will be donated to the hospice that actually helped me care for her." Marcus stepped toward me, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You think you can just take our inheritance? We'll tie you up in court for decades. You won't see a penny." "You can try," I said, pointing to the screen where Eleanor was still smiling. "But remember, she recorded her entire medical history for the last year. Every lucid moment, every conversation with her doctors, and every single time I tried to call you while she was crying for her family. I have the logs, Marcus. I have the truth. Do you really want that played in a courtroom?" They looked at the screen, then at the papers in my hand, and finally at me. For the first time in 5 years, they didn't see a poor relative. They saw the woman who had inherited the strength of the woman they had abandoned. Beatrice grabbed her silk wrap, her eyes wet with tears of fury. "You'll regret this, Claire. You'll be alone in this big, rotting house." "I've been alone here for 5 years, Beatrice, but for the first time, I finally have some breathing room." I watched them scramble to their cars, their tires spitting gravel as they fled the scene of their failed heist. When the sound of the engines faded, I closed the door and leaned against it. The house was quiet, the air was cold, and for the first time it didn't smell of medicine anymore. It smelled of freedom.
The visiting room of the state penitentiary smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a sharp, clinical scent that stripped away any illusion of power. I sat behind the reinforced glass, my hands resting on the cold metal counter. I wasn't wearing my designer blazer today. I wore a simple black sweater. I didn't need the armor of a CEO anymore. I was the only person in this room with a positive net worth. Julian was led in by a guard. He looked smaller, his skin sallow under the fluorescent lights, his hair buzzed short. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit that finally matched the quality of his character. He picked up the phone, his eyes darting to mine with a mixture of hatred and a lingering, pathetic hope. "Did you come to gloat, Elena?" he rasped, his voice sounding thin through the receiver. "Did you come to see the golden boy in a cage? I hope it was worth the millions. I hope the board of Athelgard is proud of their cold-blooded leader." "I didn't come to gloat, Julian. I came to provide you with the final quarterly report," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the anger that used to fuel my late nights. The racketeering charges stuck, 5 to 7 years with no possibility of early parole given the nature of the pension fund embezzlement. You've been liquidated from the family ledger, officially. "You're a monster," he spat, leaning closer to the glass. "Mom and Dad, they'll never forgive you for this. You've destroyed their only son." "Mom and Dad are fine, Julian. They've moved into a permanent assisted living suite. It's quiet, it's safe, and most importantly, it's a place where your name is never mentioned. They've started a garden. Silas even joined a local chess club.
They are finally living a life that isn't built on a house of cards. They don't miss the golden boy. They miss the peace they never had because of you." Julian laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "And the business, the Thorn legacy? I bet you sold it to the highest bidder, turned the warehouse into a parking lot for your tech bros." "Actually, no," I said, leaning back. "I kept the property, but Thorn Hardware and Supply no longer exists. I've converted the entire operation into the Thorn Vocational Foundation. We're using the old warehouse to train young people from broken homes in financial literacy and trade skills. We're teaching them how to build an inheritance that can't be gambled away in a weekend. It's the first time that name has ever stood for something sustainable." Julian's face twisted in a silent rage. He hated that I had transformed his failure into a public good. He hated that the nothing he left behind was now the seed for someone else's everything. "You think you won, Elena, but you're alone. You have your billions and your glass tower, and you have absolutely no one who loves you for who you are. You're just a balance sheet in a silk dress." "I'd rather be a balanced ledger than a bankrupt soul, Julian," I replied, standing up. "And as for being alone, I've spent 5 years building a world where no one can take anything from me. That isn't loneliness, that's sovereignty. I don't need to be loved by people who only see me as a source of liquidity. I'm finally at peace with my own value." I hung up the receiver before he could say another word. I watched the guard lead him away, a small orange speck retreating into the gray labyrinth of the prison. I walked out of the facility, the cold air of the evening hitting my face like a reset button. I drove back to the city, but I didn't go to my office. I drove to the old neighborhood, to the street where the amber-lit house used to stand. It was gone now. In its place was the construction site for the housing unit I'd promised, a modern, airy building designed to give shelter to those the world had tried to silence. I stood by the fence, watching the sunset reflect off the steel girders. I thought about the $84,000 I'd lost 5 years ago. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like a small, necessary price for the freedom I now possessed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from my head of acquisitions. IPO successfully launched. Valuation exceeded targets by 15%. Market sentiment bullish on Thorn. I smiled. The market wasn't just bullish on my company, it was bullish on the fact that I had survived the crash of my own family. I got back into my car and drove toward the skyline, the lights of the city rising up to meet me like a promise kept. I wasn't the daughter who sacrificed. I wasn't the sister who settled. I was the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in 30 years, the internal audit was complete. The investment in nothing yielded the ultimate return. Me.
The morning after the confrontation with Dr. Sterling, the fog over Blackwood Manor was so thick it felt like the house was floating in a void. I sat in the library, the archive of neglect spread out before me like a map of a battlefield. I was exhausted, but for the first time, my fatigue felt clean. It was the weariness of a soldier who had held the line, not a servant who had been overlooked. The phone rang at 9 a.m. It wasn't Marcus. It was Arthur Vance, Eleanor's longtime attorney. "Claire." His voice was deep, resonant, and carried a weight of authority that calmed my racing heart. "I've received a series of frantic and rather poorly phrased emails from your brother's legal counsel. It seems they attempted to retain my services last night. They offered me a retainer that was, well, let's just say it was an insult to my professional ethics and my memory of Eleanor." "They tried to buy you, Arthur?" I asked, looking at a photo of him and Eleanor from the 1980s tucked into one of the journals.
They were standing on a pier, wind in their hair, looking like a secret the world wasn't allowed to know. They tried to reorient my perspective, Arthur corrected me with a dry chuckle. Marcus believes that everyone has a price. He doesn't understand that some debts are paid in time, not currency. I told him I was unavailable. I also told him that if he contacted me again, I would move the probate hearing to the earliest possible date. I'll be at the manor in an hour. We have things to discuss that weren't in the video. When Arthur arrived, he didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a man who was mourning a part of himself. He carried a battered leather briefcase and a single white rose, which he placed on the mantel beneath Eleanor's portrait. "She loved you, Claire," he said, turning to me. "Not just because you took care of her, but because you were the only one who didn't try to change the frequency of her soul. The rest of them, they wanted her to be a bank, a legacy, a ghost. You let her be a woman." We sat in the study, the journals of Betrayal stacked between us. "Marcus is desperate," Arthur said, opening his briefcase. "He's leveraged his own firm to the hilt, counting on this inheritance to bail him out. If he doesn't get Blackwood by Christmas, he's bankrupt by Christmas. That makes him dangerous. He's currently trying to track down Eleanor's old medical records from a clinic in Switzerland, hoping to find a diagnosis of early-onset dementia from a decade ago. But she didn't have dementia then. She was sharp until the very end. I know that, you know that, but Marcus only needs a shadow of a doubt to freeze the accounts." I leaned forward. "However, Eleanor gave me a counter-lever. She knew they'd go after her mind, so she left a trail of her own. Tell me, Claire, did she ever mention the blue envelopes?" I shook my head. "No, we'd talked about everything, the garden, the books, the neighbors, but never blue envelopes." "They're not here," Arthur said, a predatory glint appearing in his eyes. "They sent them to me, one by one, over the last 5 years. Every time Marcus or Beatrice asked her for a loan that was actually a demand, she sent me the correspondence along with a signed, notarized statement of her mental clarity at that exact moment. I have 52 envelopes, Claire. Each one contains a direct refusal of their greed, written in her own hand, with a psychiatric evaluation attached from a different doctor each time. She spent a fortune on those secret evaluations just to build this wall around you." I felt a lump form in my throat. All those times I thought she was just resting or having a private meeting, she was building my fortress. She was fighting a war for me while I was making her tea. "But there's more," Arthur's voice dropped. "Marcus has a secret of his own, one that Eleanor discovered through her private investigators. It's the reason he's so desperate for this house. He didn't just lose money, Claire. He stole it from his own clients. He's been running a shell game with their investments, and the auditors are closing in." Suddenly, the sound of a car horn blared from the driveway. Not one car, but 3. I looked out the window. Marcus was back, but he wasn't alone. He had brought a group of men in suits, investors, I realized. He was giving them a tour of the property as if he already owned it. "And here," I heard Marcus's voice through the open window, loud and arrogant, "is where we'll put the new wing. We'll clear out these old gardens, nothing but weeds and dead air anyway, and put in a state-of-the-art wellness center. This estate is the crown jewel of my new portfolio." I felt a surge of cold fury. He was selling her roses while they were still in bloom. He was erasing her garden before she was even cold. "Arthur," I said, my voice shaking with a newfound power, "can we use the blue envelopes now?" "Not yet," Arthur said, standing up and smoothing his suit. "Let's give him enough rope to hang himself. Let him make his promises to these men. Let him sign his intent to develop papers, and then we'll show him the scent of his own medicine." I walked out onto the porch, Arthur right behind me. Marcus saw me and smiled, that shark-like empty smile that had fooled so many people for so long. "Ah, Claire, still here? I'm just showing my partners the potential of the Thorne estate. Don't mind us. We'll be out of your hair soon. I've decided to be generous. I'll let you stay in the guest cottage until the end of the month. No charge. The guest cottage is for guests, Marcus, and since you're not one, I suggest you take your partners and leave my garden. You're trespassing on private property owned by the Claire Thorne Trust. The trust is a fantasy, Claire, Marcus sneered, turning back to his investors. My lawyers are filing the injunction as we speak. This house is a Thorne asset. It always has been. Arthur stepped forward, pulling a blue envelope from his jacket. Actually, Marcus, the house hasn't been a Thorne asset since 2019. That was the year Eleanor sold the deed to a private holding company, a company whose sole shareholder is Claire. Marcus froze. The investors looked at each other, their faces turning from curiosity to suspicion. "What are you talking about?" Marcus hissed. "I'm talking about the fact that Eleanor didn't just leave Claire the house in her will. She sold it to her years ago for the sum of $1 and lifelong devoted service. The will you're contesting is just a formality for the liquid assets. The land beneath your feet, Marcus, hasn't belonged to you or your father's line in half a decade. Claire isn't just the heir, Marcus, she's the landlord, and I believe she just asked you to leave." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at the men in suits, the men Marcus had promised a piece of my home. They were looking at Marcus now, and their expressions were cold. They weren't seeing a visionary developer, they were seeing a fraud. "Is this true, Marcus?" one of the men asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You told us the title was clear. You took our deposits based on that title." Marcus's face went from red to a sickly, translucent white. He looked at Arthur, then at the blue envelope, then at me. The scent of lavender and medicinal steam seemed to rise from the ground, a ghostly reminder of the woman who had planned this moment with the precision of a master surgeon. "I can explain," Marcus stammered. "Explain it to your creditors, Marcus," I said, stepping back onto the porch, "and to the police, because if you're still on my grass in 5 minutes, I'm calling the sheriff to report a group of strangers trying to sell property that doesn't belong to them." I watched them scramble, the partners pulling away from Marcus as if he were radioactive, the cars peeling out of the driveway one by one. Marcus was the last to leave, standing alone on the gravel, a man who had tried to build a kingdom on a grave and found that the grave was empty. I went back inside and sat with Arthur. He opened the white rose and placed it in a vase on Eleanor's desk. "That was the first blue envelope," he said. "There are 51 more. Each one is a different trap Eleanor set for them. She knew they'd come for the house first. She wanted you to see them fail before you even had to open the rest." I looked at the rose, then at the manor that was now truly mine, not just by blood, but by a battle fought in the shadows. The scent of the medicine was gone. Now the house smelled of old books, fresh rain, and the quiet, unyielding power of a woman who had finally been heard.
The afternoon sun struggled to pierce the heavy velvet curtains of the study, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Arthur had left an hour ago, leaving me with a stack of legal documents and the heavy golden key to Eleanor's private wall safe. I stood before the portrait of Eleanor's mother, my fingers tracing the cold, gilded frame until I found the hidden catch. The painting swung open, revealing a steel door that looked more at home in a bank than a Victorian manor. As I prepared to turn the dial, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. It wasn't the frantic pounding of Marcus. It was a rhythmic, delicate tapping, the sound of someone who wanted to be invited in, but didn't quite belong. I opened the door to find Beatrice. She wasn't wearing her funeral black anymore. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored cashmere coat, looking every bit the grieving niece who had finally found her composure. In her hand, she held a small box of Eleanor's favorite macarons from the city. "Claire, dear," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, "I've been thinking. Marcus is, well, he's lost his mind. He's obsessed with the house, and he's going to drag this family through the mud. I want no part of it. I want to help you." I didn't step aside. "Help me, Beatrice, or help yourself to what's left of the liquid assets?" "I'm being sincere," she insisted, her eyes wide and watery. "I know Marcus was skimming from the estate funds even while Eleanor was alive. I have copies of the wire transfers. I can give them to Arthur Vance. I can be your star witness. All I ask is that we handle the jewelry privately. There are pieces that have been in the Thorne family for generations, things Eleanor promised me when I was a little girl. You wouldn't want those to end up in a cold, impersonal probate auction, would you?" I looked at the box of macarons. They were expensive, colorful, and hollow, just like her. "Come in, Beatrice," I said, a cold curiosity taking hold. "Let's see what Eleanor promised you." I led her into the study. She gasped when she saw the open safe behind the portrait, her eyes lit up with a hunger so naked it was almost tragic. She moved toward it, her gloved hand reaching out as if to touch a holy relic. "Is that it? The sapphire set? The Romanov brooch?" "I haven't opened it yet," I said, stepping between her and the safe. "I was waiting for the right moment, but since you're here to help, why don't we see what's inside together?" I turned the dial, left to 22, right to 04, left to 38. The heavy bolts slid back with a sound like a guillotine falling. I pulled the door open. There were no velvet-lined boxes of diamonds. There were no stacks of cash or gold bars. Instead, the safe was filled with hundreds of small, clear glass vials, each one labeled with a date and a name. Beside them sat a single thick leather binder titled "The Scent of Deception." Beatrice's face fell. "What is this? Where are the jewels? Where is the Thorne heritage?" I pulled out the binder and opened it to the first page. It wasn't a list of gems. It was a log of chemical compositions. "Eleanor was a chemist before she married into this family, Beatrice," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "She didn't just collect jewelry. She collected data. She was fascinated by the way people lie, how their scents change when they're being untruthful. She spent the last 10 years of her life documenting the aromas of her visitors." I pulled out a vial labeled Beatrice, October 12, 2024. "This was the day you came to visit her, the day you told her you needed $200,000 for charity work in South America. Eleanor noted that you smelled of expensive gin and the specific leather in the interior of a private jet. She kept the air filter from the room that day. She analyzed the particles." I turned the page in the binder. There, taped to the paper, was a receipt. It wasn't charity work. It was a deposit on a villa in Tuscany. You used your dying aunt's charity to buy a vacation home while I was sleeping on a cot in her room because we couldn't afford a night nurse. Beatrice's face went from cream to a sallow, sickly yellow. "She spied on me? That's illegal. That's a violation of privacy." "She wasn't spying. She was diagnosing the family," I countered. I pulled out another vial, this one much larger. "And this is from the night you tried to swap the real Thorne emeralds for glass fakes. You thought she was asleep. You didn't realize the jewelry boxes were rigged with a silent pressure sensor and a fine mist of ultraviolet dye." I walked over to a small UV lamp on the desk and switched it on. I pointed it at Beatrice's coat. A constellation of glowing blue specks erupted across her sleeves and chest. She looked like she had been caught in a shower of radioactive stardust. "The dye stays for years on high-quality wool, Beatrice," I said. "Eleanor didn't report you to the police. She wanted to see if you'd ever admit it. She wanted to see if you'd ever come back and say, 'I'm sorry, I was desperate.' But you never did. You just kept coming back for more, smelling of fake tears and stolen emeralds." Beatrice backed away, her hands clutching her throat.
I'll tell them you framed me. I'll tell them you put that light there. No one will believe a crazy old woman and her caregiver. The real emeralds are in a safety deposit box in Arthur's name, Beatrice. I closed the binder with a heavy thud. And as for the jewelry Eleanor promised you, there is one thing she left specifically for you in the bottom of the safe. I reached in and pulled out a small, tethered cardboard box. I handed it to her. Beatrice opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single rusted silver spoon, the one she had used to feed Eleanor the only time she ever bothered to stay for a meal in 5 years. "There is a note," I said. Beatrice pulled out a small slip of paper. In Eleanor's sharp, unwavering hand it read, "For Beatrice, the only thing you ever gave me was a mouthful of cold soup and a heart full of warm lies. Use this spoon to dig yourself out of the debt you've created. It is the only heritage you have left." Beatrice dropped the box, the spoon clattering against the floor. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a jagged, ugly hatred. "You think you've won, Claire? You think you're better than us because she liked the way you smelled of disinfectants? You're just a servant who got lucky. Marcus is already talking to the tabloids. He's going to tell everyone that Eleanor was a paranoid recluse who lived in a house of horrors. Your archive won't mean anything when the world thinks you're both insane." "Let them talk," I said, walking her towards the door. "I've spent 5 years in the silence of this house. I don't care about the noise of the world. But Beatrice, before you go, remember this. The house is 9. The emeralds are mine, and your villa in Tuscany. I've already contacted the Italian authorities regarding the source of the funds used for the purchase. I believe they'll find the charity link quite fascinating." Beatrice didn't scream. She didn't shout. She simply turned and fled, her cashmere coat glowing blue in the shadows of the hallway, a ghost of her own greed. I went back to the study and picked up the rusted spoon. I placed it back in the safe. Then I pulled out a fresh journal. I wrote the first entry, March 19th, 2026. "The air in Blackwood Manor is finally clear. The scent of the Thorne family is gone. Now the house smells of nothing but the future." I looked at the portrait of Eleanor. She seemed to be smiling now, her eyes bright with the secret we finally shared. The last will wasn't just about money. It was about the fact that some things, like truth and loyalty, don't have a price. They only have a scent. And I was the only one who knew how to breathe.
The night was unnervingly still. The fog had settled into a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the tops of the ancient oaks surrounding the manor. Inside, I was alphabetizing the final batch of Eleanor's research notes, the rhythmic scratching of my pen the only sound in the vast, hollow house. Then, the smell hit me. It wasn't the sterile scent of rubbing alcohol or the sweet lavender of Eleanor's pillows. It was sharp, acrid, and hungry. Smoke. I ran to the window. The old carriage house, located 50 yards from the main wing, was glowing with a sickly, pulsating orange light. Flames were already licking the dry timber of the roof, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like giants battling in the mist. "Marcus," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my phone to call the fire department, but as I reached the hallway, the power cut out. The manor plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. My breath hitched. This wasn't a random short circuit. This was deliberate. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer. As the beam cut through the gloom, I saw that the back door, the one I had locked twice, was standing wide open. Marcus wasn't just burning the carriage house to destroy the archives. He wanted the main house. He wanted the journals. He wanted me to run outside so he could get inside. I didn't run for the garden. I ran for the study. "I know you're here, Marcus," I shouted, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "The fire department is on their way. You're adding arson to your list of felonies." I heard a floorboard creak in the library. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, a silhouette of a man holding a heavy brass crowbar. Marcus looked feral. His suit was torn, his tie gone, and his eyes reflected the orange glow from the windows like a cornered animal. "The journals, Claire," he rasped, his voice thick with smoke and desperation. "Where are they? I know you didn't keep them in the carriage house. You're too meticulous for that. Give them to me and I'll let you walk out of here before the main house goes up." "You're pathetic, Marcus," I said, keeping the flashlight beam directly on his face to blind him. "You think burning paper will erase what you did? The digital copies are already with Arthur. Burning this house won't save your firm. It won't stop the auditors." "I don't care about the auditors anymore," he roared, lunging toward me. I dodged behind the heavy oak desk, the crowbar smashing into the wood with a splintering crack. "The fire is a distraction, isn't it?" I asked, my mind racing. "You didn't just come for the books. You came for the safe." "The safe is empty, you idiot," Marcus spat, clutching his shoulder. "Beatrice told me. Just a bunch of vials and a rusted spoon." "She lied to you, Marcus," I said, a cold realization dawning on me. "Beatrice didn't tell you everything. She wanted you to be the one to burn the evidence so she could walk away clean. She's the one who gave you the lighter, wasn't she?" Marcus froze. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Beatrice had used him. She incited his rage, knowing he was unstable, hoping he would destroy the manor while she maintained her grieving niece persona from a safe distance. She said if the house burned, the insurance would trigger a payout to the blood heirs regardless of the will. "There is no insurance payout for arson committed by a family member, Marcus," I said, stepping closer. "She set you up to take the fall. While you're in prison for burning down Blackwood, she'll be in Tuscany, living off the money she stole from Eleanor's charity fund." Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from the floor above, the sound of breaking glass. I looked up. The smoke was getting thicker in the hallway, but the fire wasn't coming from the carriage house anymore. It was coming from the second floor, from Eleanor's bedroom. "Marcus?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did you start a fire upstairs too?" "No," he said, his face turning a ghastly shade of gray. "I only touched the carriage house. I wanted you to run out so I could get the binder." We both looked at each other. If Marcus didn't start the fire in the main house, then someone else was already inside, someone who wanted to make sure there were no survivors to testify. A silhouette appeared at the top of the grand staircase. It wasn't a man. It was the slight, elegant figure of a woman holding a canister of accelerant. Beatrice! She didn't look like the cream-colored cashmere niece anymore. She was wearing a dark jumpsuit, her face smeared with soot, her eyes burning with a cold, calculated madness. "You both talk too much," Beatrice called down, her voice eerily calm over the roar of the flames growing behind her. "Marcus, you were always the blunt instrument, useful but loud. And Claire, you were the perfect servant, but servants are supposed to disappear when the masters are finished." She tossed a lit match onto the silk runner of the staircase. The fire raced down the fabric like a golden snake, cutting off our only exit to the front door. "The journals aren't the only thing Eleanor kept, Claire," she shouted over the crackle of the flames growing behind her.
The original ledger of the Thorn shipping business, the one that proves the heritage Marcus is so proud of, was built on illegal smuggling during the war. If that ledger survives, our family assets are seized by the federal government. I'm not losing my villa because of an old woman's conscience. "Beatrice, stop!" Marcus shouted, moving toward the stairs. "We can settle this. We're blood." "Blood is just a stain, Marcus," she replied, turning to disappear into the smoke of the upper floor. "And tonight, I'm cleaning the house." The heat was becoming unbearable. The ancient wood of the manor was hungry, the fire climbing the tapestries and devouring the history of the Thorn family. "The hidden study!" I grabbed Marcus by the arm. "It's reinforced with lead and stone. It's the only place the fire won't reach." "What about you?" Marcus asked, looking at me with a strange, fleeting moment of humanity. "I'm getting the binder," I said, lunging for the safe. I reached the safe, the metal hot to the touch. I dialed the code with trembling fingers. Click. I grabbed the leather binder and the small box of charity receipts. The ceiling groaned. A massive crystal chandelier, the centerpiece of the library, shattered onto the floor just inches from us, sending a spray of glass like diamonds into the air. "Go, now!" I shoved Marcus toward the cedar closet. We scrambled into the hidden study, slamming the stone door shut just as the library was engulfed in a wall of flame. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old paper, the last sanctuary of truth in a house of lies. I sat on the floor, clutching the binder to my chest, listening to the muffled roar of the destruction above. Marcus sat across from me, his head in his hands, finally realizing that the inheritance he had chased had turned into a pyre. "She's gone, isn't she?" Marcus whispered, looking at me with a strange, fleeting moment of humanity. "She made her choice, Marcus," I said, looking at the stone walls. "She tried to burn the past, but the past is the only thing that's going to survive tonight." We sat in the dark, the caregiver and the heir, waiting for the sirens that were finally screaming in the distance. The scent of the medicine was long gone, replaced by the smell of scorched earth. But as I held Eleanor's journals, I knew that even if the walls fell, the story wouldn't end in ash.
The air in the hidden study was growing thin, vibrating with the muffled, rhythmic thud of falling beams from the floors above. The stone walls were cool, but the ceiling radiated a terrifying heat. Marcus sat slumped against a shelf of journals, his face smeared with soot, looking like a man who had finally reached the end of his tether. "The service tunnel," I said, my voice cracking from the smoke I'd already inhaled. "Eleanor told me it leads to the old boathouse. It's the only way out, Marcus, but it hasn't been opened in decades. It might be flooded." "Let it be flooded," Marcus muttered, staring at his trembling hands. "It's better than being cremated by Beatrice. She always was the smartest of us, Claire. She knew exactly which match to light to make the world forget her sins." "We're not staying here to die for her sins," I snapped, grabbing the leather binder and stuffing it into my waterproof satchel. I found the lever Eleanor had described, a brass handle shaped like a lion's head, hidden behind a false row of books. I pulled it. With a grinding groan of rusted gears, a segment of the stone wall slid back, revealing a dark, damp passage that smelled of mud and ancient rot. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off standing water that reached my ankles. "Move, Marcus," I commanded. We stepped into the tunnel. The silence here was different, heavy, subterranean, and punctuated by the distant, ghostly roar of the fire above. As we waded deeper, the water rose to our knees, cold enough to steal the breath from my lungs. "Why did she do it, Claire? Why you?
There were a dozen relatives with better pedigrees, people with Thorn in their middle names. You were just the daughter of a runaway cousin, a nobody. Maybe she liked nobodies who didn't try to steal her emeralds, I replied, focusing on the path ahead. No, Marcus laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Eleanor didn't do anything out of liking someone. She was a chemist. She dealt in reactions and constants. She chose you because you were the only Thorn left who wasn't a lie. I stopped, the water swirling around my waist. What is that supposed to mean? Marcus leaned against the damp wall, his eyes catching the light of my torch. Your father, Eleanor's brother, he was a shadow of a man. But your mother, Sarah, she wasn't just a runaway cousin. She was Eleanor's twin sister's daughter. But the father, the man Sarah ran away with? My heart skipped a beat. My mother had never spoken of my father. He was a blank space in my history, a ghost she had taken to her grave. Your father was the true heir to the shipping empire, Claire, the one my grandfather cheated out of the business before the war. You aren't a distant branch of this family. You are the trunk. Eleanor didn't give you the house. She was returning it to the rightful line. She kept you close for 5 years to see if the blood had stayed pure or if you were as rotten as the rest of us. I felt the world tilt. The 5 years of care, the milligrams, the nights of whispered poetry. It wasn't just a test of my character. It was a restoration. I wasn't the poor relative who got lucky. I was the owner who had finally come home, even if the home was currently burning to ash. She knew. All this time, she knew who I was. She knew, Marcus confirmed, a strange, twisted respect in his voice. And she knew Beatrice and I would try to kill you for it. That's why the journals are so detailed. That's why the house is rigged. You weren't the nurse, Claire. You were the queen in waiting. A sudden, violent tremor shook the tunnel. Dust and mortar fell from the ceiling. Above us, the main library must have collapsed. The water in the tunnel began to surge, pushed by some unseen pressure. "The boathouse!" I yelled. "We have to run!" We splashed through the rising water, the tunnel narrowing until we were crouching. The smell of the lake, fresh, cold, and mossy, began to cut through the scent of fire. Finally, we saw a sliver of gray moonlight ahead. We burst through a rotted wooden door and collapsed onto the muddy bank of the lake. Behind us, Blackwood Manor was a towering inferno, a jagged crown of fire against the black sky. The heat was still intense, even from this distance, but the air was sweet and clean. I lay on my back, clutching the satchel to my chest, watching the embers dance like angry fireflies. Marcus sat a few feet away, watching the destruction of his dreams with a vacant, shattered expression. "It's over," he said. "The house is gone." "The house is gone, Marcus," I said, sitting up and feeling the weight of the binder. "But the truth isn't, and neither am I." In the distance, the sirens were getting louder. Searchlights began to sweep the woods. I looked at the fire and realized that Beatrice was still up there, or perhaps she had found her own way out. But it didn't matter. The last will had been executed. The fire hadn't destroyed the inheritance. It had simply burned away the rot. I stood up, my wet dress clinging to my skin, the daughter of the true heir finally standing on her own land. I didn't feel like a servant. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the fire itself, destructive to those who deserved it, and life-giving to those who knew how to hold the flame.
The hospital room smelled of lemon disinfectant and cheap floor wax, a scent that had haunted my life for 5 years, but now it felt like a cage rather than a sanctuary. My lungs burned with every breath, a lingering souvenir of the smoke I'd swallowed in the library. Beside my bed, the waterproof satchel was still there, guarded by a police officer stationed at the door. Arthur Vance had seen to that. "You're lucky to be alive, Claire,"
Arthur said, his voice sounding hollow in the small room. He looked older, his suit wrinkled, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a man who had watched his life's work burn. Marcus is in the next wing. He's talking to the investigators. He's admitting to the carriage house fire, but he's terrified of what Beatrice might do next. "Where is she, Arthur?" I asked, my voice a raspy whisper. "They didn't find a body in the ruins." "No," Arthur sighed, looking out the window at the morning sun. "The fire department says the upper floor collapsed into the cellar. It could take days to sift through the debris, but for now she's missing. Presumed vanished." My phone, which the paramedics had recovered from the boathouse, buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. It was an unknown number, one message. "The smell of smoke looks good on you, Claire, but the smell of a prison cell will look better. Check your email. The police already have their copy. Sleep tight, cousin." I opened my laptop with shaking hands. An email was waiting. Attached was a video file, time-stamped 10 minutes before the fire started. I clicked play. The video showed Eleanor's bedroom. It was a high-angle shot, likely from a hidden camera I hadn't known about, one Beatrice must have installed. In the video, a woman who looked exactly like me was standing over Eleanor's bed, holding a pillow. She was pressing it down. Eleanor's frail legs kicked twice, then went still. The figure turned slightly, showing a face that was an uncanny, deep-fake perfect replica of mine. "Arthur?" I choked out, turning the screen toward him. She's framing me for murder." Arthur watched the video, his jaw tightening until the bone beneath his skin looked like it would snap. It's a masterpiece of deception. The lighting, the angle, the hesitation. She's been planning this since before Eleanor even died. She didn't want the house to burn just for the insurance, Claire. She wanted it to burn to destroy any forensic evidence that could prove Eleanor died of natural causes. "But I was downstairs," I cried. "I was in the kitchen when she died. I have the logs from the oxygen concentrator." The concentrator that burned to a puddle of plastic last night. The logs that were stored on a local server that is now ash. Beatrice knew exactly what to destroy. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open. 2 detectives I hadn't seen before entered, their faces grim. Behind them stood a woman I recognized from the tabloids, the district attorney's lead investigator. "Claire Thorne?" the taller detective asked. "We've received some disturbing evidence regarding the death of Eleanor Thorne. We're going to need you to come down to the station for a formal interrogation, and we'll be seizing that satchel as evidence." "This satchel contains the truth," I shouted, clutching the bag to my chest. "It contains the journals that prove Beatrice Thorne is the one who wanted Eleanor dead." "We've seen the video, Miss Thorne," the investigator said, her voice like ice. "It's hard to argue with a visual record of a suffocation. As for the journals, a caregiver writing about a family conspiracy often looks like someone building a preemptive defense. Hand over the bag." I looked at Arthur. He gave me a slow, subtle nod. He wasn't giving up, he was playing the long game. I let go of the satchel. As they led me out of the hospital in handcuffs, the hallway felt like a gauntlet. Nurses looked away. Patients whispered. The saintly caregiver had become the calculated killer in the span of an hour. But as I reached the elevator, I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass doors. A woman in a nurse's uniform, wearing a surgical mask and a wig, was standing at the end of the corridor. Her eyes, cold, blue, and triumphant, met mine for a split second. Beatrice. She wasn't dead. She wasn't even hiding. She was watching her masterpiece unfold. She leaned in, her lips moving behind the mask. She didn't make a sound, but I could read the words perfectly. "The smell of your medicine." The elevator doors closed, and the descent began. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance anymore. I was fighting for my life. But Beatrice made one fatal mistake. She thought the deepfake was her best weapon. She forgot that I was a chemist's student. I knew that every reaction leaves a trace, and every lie has a specific gravity. In the satchel she had just let the police take, tucked in the back cover of the 2025 journal, was something she hadn't found. A small, thermal-sealed vial of the air from Eleanor's room at the exact moment of her death, an air Eleanor had triggered herself using a medical-grade black box device she'd hidden in the headbed. The air in that vial wouldn't smell like me. It would smell like the specific, rare perfume Beatrice had imported from Florence, the one Eleanor had meticulously documented in her Archive of Deception. The scent of the truth was about to become the scent of her conviction.
The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, casting a sterile, sickly pallor over the interrogation room. Across the scratched metal table, the lead investigator pushed the laptop toward me one last time. The looped video of me pressing a pillow over Eleanor's face was a flickering nightmare, a digital lie designed to erase 5 years of devotion. "The metadata checks out, Miss Thorne," the investigator said, leaning into my personal space, her breath smelling of stale coffee. "The biometrics match your bone structure perfectly. Your brother Marcus has already admitted you were the only one with the medical codes to the room that night. Why not just admit it? You stayed for the money, you got impatient, and you took the shortcut." "I didn't take a shortcut," I said, my voice raspy from the smoke but as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I took a sample." I pointed to the black satchel sitting on the evidence table, now tagged with a yellow crime scene label. "In the back lining of the 2025 journal, there's a small, vacuum-sealed glass vial. It's a medical-grade atmospheric sampler. My aunt was a chemist. My cousins spent years calling her paranoid to discredit her, but that paranoia was her greatest invention. She installed a VOC, volatile organic compound sensor, in her headboard. It triggers a silent vacuum seal if a non-medical foreign scent is detected within 2 feet of her face. It triggered at 11:42 p.m. on the night she died." The investigator frowned, glancing at her partner. "A scent sensor? You're telling me the air caught the killer?" "I'm telling you that human skin, stress hormones, and expensive perfumes leave a molecular trail that no camera can see. If that video is real, that vial will contain traces of my sweat, my laundry detergent, and the specific antiseptic I used on my hands every hour. But if it's a fake, if someone else was in that room wearing a silicone mask, that vial will contain the scent of their truth." Arthur Vance stood in the corner, his silent presence a wall of legal protection. "I suggest you run a gas chromatography mass spectrometry test on that sample immediately, Detective. If you ignore physical forensic evidence in favor of a digital file that can be manipulated by any teenager with a high-end PC, this entire case will collapse, and I'll make sure the medical board knows why." It took 6 hours. 6 hours of sitting in that gray room, listening to the muffled sounds of the precinct and the ticking of a clock that felt like a heart. Then the door opened. The investigator didn't look triumphant anymore. She looked deeply unsettled, holding a thermal printout as if it were a confession. "We ran the test, Claire," she said, dropping the report on the table. "The air sample doesn't match your profile. There's no trace of the soap you use. But we did find a high concentration of Jasminum grandiflorum, a specific vintage extraction, and microscopic traces of a high-end medical silicone adhesive." "The Florence jasmine," Arthur whispered, a grim, satisfied smile touching his lips. "Beatrice's signature scent, and the adhesive from her deepfake mask." "There's more," the detective said, looking at me with a newfound respect that felt like a quiet apology. "We tracked the IP address of the nurse who was seen in the hospital corridor. She was using the guest Wi-Fi to upload a second batch of files to a server in Switzerland. We caught her at a bus station 3 blocks away. She was still wearing the wig." The final confrontation didn't happen in a manor or a courtroom. It happened in the processing center.
I stood behind the reinforced glass as they led Beatrice in. She looked broken, her elegant jumpsuit replaced by a gray detention smock. The mask was gone, revealing the face of a woman who had gambled her soul for a villa and lost it to a single breath of air. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a cold, flickering rage that could no longer burn me. "You were just a servant," she hissed, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to be the one we stepped on to get to the Thorn Gold." "I forgot one thing, Beatrice," I said, leaning toward the glass until my breath fogged it. "Eleanor didn't just leave me the gold. She left me her eyes. She knew that people like you think the world is made of things you can grab and sell. She knew you'd never understand that the most valuable things are the ones you can't see: loyalty, memory, and the scent of a life well lived." Beatrice was led away, her screams echoing through the hall until the heavy steel doors muffled her into a permanent silence. A week later, I stood on the charred remains of the Blackwood Manor terrace. The house was a skeleton of blackened stone, but the garden was already starting to push through the soot, green shoots defying the ash. Arthur stood beside me, holding a final blue envelope. "This is the last one," he said, handing it to me. "She told me to give it to you only when the air was finally clear of them." I opened it. There was no legal jargon, no deeds, just a small pressed sprig of dried lavender and a note in Eleanor's elegant hand. "To Claire, the true daughter of my heart. The fire was always coming. Greed like theirs always ends in a blaze. But remember this: you cannot burn the scent of the rain. You cannot burn the truth of a hand held in the dark. Use the insurance money to build the school we talked about. Let the Thorn name finally mean something that heals instead of something that hides. You are the architect now. Build something that breathes." I looked out over the lake, the water reflecting the first clear blue sky I had seen in years. The nothing I had started with, the 5 years of quiet service, had turned into a legacy that would outlast the stones of the manor. I wasn't the girl who sat by the bed anymore. I was the woman who had survived the fire and captured the wind. I breathed in deeply. The air was cold, sharp, and perfectly clear. It smelled of wet earth, of new beginnings, and for the first time in my life, it smelled like home.